Testing. All right. So let's jump back in and we'll finish this out. All right. So the carpal region is the wrist, and the carpal bones are the bones of the wrist, and there are 8 small bones that are connected to each other by ligaments, and they're arranged in 2 rows. There's a proximal row and a distal row. The proximal row consists of the scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. And they articulate with the distal end of the radius and the distal end of the ulna, specifically the styloid processes and heads of the ulna and radius. Now, the distal row of carpals includes the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Okay, they articulate with the metacarpals, which are the bones you find in the palm of the hand. Okay. Um, so let's see. We have. I didn't include it. Okay, so there is a mnemonic that is actually in my um, notes. I posted some notes on online in the class section. Let's see, where are they? Um, hmm, just a second. All right, here we go. Let me bring the video back up. Okay, so I posted these lecture notes or study guide in the class section. Here's the mnemonic. Sally left the party to take Kathy home. Okay, now this starts with the proximal row and then the distal row. Okay, and if you can remember the names, scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform. All right, so that's Sally, scaphoid, lunate left the triquetrum, pisiform party. Second row or distal row, to take Kathy home, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. And you can see the locations of those bones here. Here we have let's see, is this the right or left hand? Left hand, so this is the anterior view. This is the posterior view. So if you were looking at your own left hand with the palm facing you, from left to right, it would be scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform. And then the pisiform down here, that name means P shape, and so it's got a kind of rounded P shape over here. And then the distal row, okay, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Okay. All right, those are the 8 metacarpals. As far as I'm concerned, you don't necessarily need to, for my exams, you don't necessarily need to remember, um, the exact rows. You don't necessarily need to remember that the trapezium articulates with metacarpal 1, but it would be good to know which ones are in the distal row and which ones are in the proximal row. All right. So you can find this online, and if you have any trouble finding it, let me know. All right. So, yes, so then there are 5 metacarpals in the hand. These are the long bones you find in the palm of the hand, and they make up, yes, the palm and the back of the hand. And they're numbered 1 through 5, starting on the thumb side. Okay, on the thumb side it's numbered 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 down on the pinky side or the small finger side. So the bases articulate with the distal row of metacarpals, and then they have heads that articulate with the proximal phalanges. Now the phalanges are the bones of the fingers or the digits. Digits is the proper word for fingers. And they're going to be 14 in all. The thumb contains 2. There's a proximal and a distal phalanx in the thumb, and then the other fingers, the other four fingers, each have three: a proximal, a middle, and a distal phalanx. Okay. Now the proper name for uh, the proper name for the thumb, yes, is the pollex. Sorry. It's the pollex. The thumb is the pollex, and then we'll see later the big toe is called the hallux. They have special names. The the mnemonic trick I've always used with students and used when I was a student to remember the pollex is if you were wearing a wristwatch here, the pollex is next to the Rolex, right? The pollex is well, the thumb, and the thumb is, if you spread your hand open, the thumb's the closest finger to your wristwatch. Um, good, good, good. We covered the metacarpals. Yes. Starting on the thumb side, they are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 down on the pinky side. Okay. And then the phalanges. Phalanges is plural. Phalanx is singular. All right. And yes, in the thumb, you're going to find a proximal and a distal phalanx. Just two. And then the other fingers are going to have three. So there's going to be a proximal, a middle, and a distal phalanx, okay, for each digit, for each finger, other than the pollex or thumb. All right, so you add that up, you've got 14 phalanges in each hand, okay, 5 metacarpals in each hand, and then 8 carpal bones in each wrist. All right, now we're moving down to the lower limbs. You've got the pelvic girdle, which is going to attach the lower limbs to the axial skeleton, and it consists of the hip bones, the os coxa, or os coxae, plural, which are also known as the coxal bones. It's actually kind of funny. These bones have like 5 different names. They're also known as the innominate bones, and ironically, the word innominate means unnamed. We're not going to bother with that. So the os coxa or coxal bones, these are your hip bones that form the pelvic girdle, and they articulate posteriorly with the sacrum. Now, different textbooks are going to disagree. Some will say the sacrum is part of the pelvic girdle and therefore part of the appendicular skeleton. Others are going to say that the sacrum is part of the axial skeleton and not part of the pelvic girdle. It's my opinion that the sacrum is part of the axial skeleton because it's composed of vertebrae and that it is technically not part of the pelvic girdle. However, I'm not going to ask you to differentiate between the two because the definition is somewhat arbitrary. All right, so each hip bone is actually made up of 3 individual bones. In the child, you will find the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, 3 separate bones. Now, of course, there will be a right and a left for 6 total bones, 3 on the right, 3 on the left. There's a right ilium, a left ilium, a right ischium, a left ischium, and a right pubis, a left pubis. Now, these 3 bones, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis, they fuse together in the adult to form one bone that we call the os coxa. All right. In between the pubis or pubic bones, there is a disc of fibrocartilage called the pubic symphysis. These 3 bones, they fuse together to form the os coxa, one hip bone, by the age of 23. Okay, and so you can see the os coxa here. This is one hip bone. And you can see they're colored differently. We have 3 different bones. The ilium is this superior bone with this large fan-shaped structure. Okay, down here we have the ischium, and we have the ischial tuberosity, which is this roughened region. It's a good site of attachment for bones acting on the thigh. Not bones, sorry, muscles acting on the thigh. And when you sit on a bicycle seat, you're going to be sitting on the ischial tuberosity. So if your butt hurts, this is where it hurts. when you sit on a bicycle seat. All right, and then lastly, up here we have the pubis. Okay. Now, these three bones in the child are separate, but by the age of 23, they will have fused together to form one bone called the os coxa. Now, there is this rounded depression here called the acetabulum. And this is the hip socket, you would call in common English, the hip socket here. And the head of the femur fits in here. Okay, it articulates with the surface of the acetabulum. And because we have this rounded depression that is very similar to the glenoid fossa or glenoid cavity, and then a rounded head of the femur that fits in here, this is technically a ball and socket joint, and ball and socket joints, as we find at the hip and in the shoulder, have a great degree of flexibility and freedom of movement. Something else that's worth mentioning is that there is a crescent moon-shaped surface in the top part of the acetabulum. It's known as the lunate surface because luna means moon, so it's a crescent moon-shaped surface. And the head of the femur actually doesn't articulate with the lunate surface. The head of the femur only articulates with this lower circular region in the acetabulum. Now, it's also worth noting, you can see from the colors here that the three bones fuse together right here in the middle of the acetabulum. All right. Anything else we want to mention? So we've got the greater sciatic notch, which the sciatic nerve will pass through. We have the obturator foramen, which is this large opening here. Good. Iliac crest, I think we mentioned in an earlier slide, but it's this narrow ridge of bone up here at the top of the ilium. All right. Anteriorly, you have the anterior superior iliac spine and the anterior inferior iliac spine. If you look at the hips of a particularly skinny person, or you feel your own here, um, or maybe you're skinny, I don't know, but you can feel this bump sticking out at the front of the hips. That is the anterior superior iliac spine. All right, so the head of the femur, which in common English is known as the thigh bone, but we will use the term femur, it articulates with the acetabulum of the hip bone in that, yes, ball and socket joint. The acetabulum is made up of all three bones, as we saw. All right, now here you can see the sacrum articulates with the ilia, okay, the two iliums, the right and the left, it articulates with both. And we have here this line called the pelvic brim. It may be difficult to see in this two-dimensional cartoony drawing, but if you had a articulated pelvis in front of you, you would be able to see this line, this ridge of bone here, known as the pelvic brim. Everything above this line, everything above this circle, everything superior to it, is the false pelvis. Everything inferior to it is the true pelvis. Okay? And it's within the true pelvis that we'll find the urinary bladder, the uterus, and the ovaries. And so we're going to find organs of the um, reproductive and urinary systems within the true pelvis. Okay, and so this would be the pelvic cavity. There's no physical barrier between the abdominal and the pelvic cavity, but there are two markers we can use. We've got the pelvic brim here, which separates the false pelvis from the true pelvis. And within the true pelvis, we find a number of reproductive and urinary structures. There are two major urinary structures that are found outside of the pelvis, and that would be the kidneys and part of the ureters. The kidneys, of course, filter blood and form urine, and then the ureters are the tubes that carry that urine down to the bladder. Um, the other marker is the peritoneum, and so the abdominal organs, the digestive organs, are covered in the peritoneum, and then the kidneys are posterior to that. But we will cover that distinction when we get to the urinary system in ANP2. Here you see the true pelvis and the false pelvis. True pelvis in blue, false pelvis in pink, as we were saying. All right. So the male and female pelvis, they differ in several ways. The bones of the male pelvis are usually larger and heavier. The differences in the female pelvis are mainly associated with the requirements of pregnancy and childbirth. The female pelvis is wider and shallower than that of the male. All right, and so on the left here we have a female pelvis, and you can see the angle here of the pubic arch. That's this angle here, okay, this pubic arch. The angle is greater than 90 degrees in the female, and in the male pelvis it's narrow, okay? The reason for this again is that the female pelvis is, yes, wider, okay, than the male pelvis. It's also not as tall as the male pelvis. The male pelvis is more tall and narrow, less wide. The distance between the anterior superior iliac spines is also greater in the female because it is, yes, wider than in the male. Okay. Um, yeah, so these are just some of the markings that if you were a forensic anthropologist like Bones, the TV show, that you would use to identify the sex of a skeleton that you had found. Or if you were a archaeologist, a bioarchaeologist, you might use some of these skeletal markings to identify the sex of a pelvis you had just found. Here's another big one. It may be a little hard to tell from this cartoony two-dimensional structure, but if you had a physical pelvis in your hand, you would be able to tell that the sacrum and the coccyx in the male are oriented forward. The reason for this is that if they're oriented back, they're more prone to breaking. In the female, however, because a baby may someday need to pass through this region, the sacrum and the coccyx are oriented more posteriorly. All right. Good. Yeah, if you had a male pelvis in your hand, you could look down inside of the pelvic brim or inlet here, and I mean you could see that the coccyx and the sacrum are largely blocking the way through. No baby would ever be able to pass through that region. It's also more narrow. All right, the brim is smaller, more narrow here, wider, more open in the female. Um, yeah. All right, so the femur is the longest and heaviest, also the strongest bone in the body. The proximal end has a rounded head that inserts into the acetabulum uh, of the os coxa, and then the distal end articulates with the tibia and the patella. Now, this is a common test question, and it's one a lot of people miss. Okay, so what bones what bones all right, so let's flip it around. The femur articulates with which bones, right? All right, so it articulates with, yes, the os coxa proximally, and then distally it articulates with the patella, that's your kneecap, and the tibia, which is the large bone in your shin. There's another bone in your shin, the fibula, but the fibula actually does not articulate with the femur. All right, so you can see that here we have the femur. Okay, proximally it articulates with the os coxa, and distally it articulates with the patella and the tibia. But if you look here, the fibula is off to the side and does not directly articulate with the femur. Okay. All right, so a couple of features that we should probably know. From a posterior view, you can see these two horn-like projections coming out of the back of the head here, and those are called the greater and the lesser trochanter. The greater trochanter is bigger than the lesser trochanter. It's also above the lesser trochanter. The gluteal tuberosity here is a raised rough area which allows for the insertion of the gluteal muscles. The gluteal muscles will act on the femur by pulling it either posteriorly or laterally. Pull it back or to the side. Pull it out or back. All right. Good, good, good. Here's the linea aspera. It's a prominent line that travels most of the length of the diaphysis. Then down distally, you have the medial and lateral condyles. Okay, medial and lateral. And then you have the medial epicondyle and the lateral epicondyle. Epi means above, and so the epicondyles are above the condyles. Now, you actually luck out here as students because, unlike the humerus, the condyles at the distal end of the femur do not get special names. Remember, the names of the condyles on the humerus were the capitulum and the trochlea. And here at the distal end of the femur, we just have the medial condyle, which is on the medial side, and the lateral condyle, which is on the lateral side. Easy. The epicondyles, again, they are above the condyles. They're these flared out regions of bone, which are the site for ligament attachment. There are going to be a lot of ligaments uh, and the capsule associated with the knee joint, associated with stabilizing the knee joint. All right. Good. Anything else? I think we're good for now. Here is the patella. It sort of looks like an upside down triangle, the base being on top, the apex, which would normally be the pointy top of a triangle. This is down here on the bottom. Here's an anterior view. There you can see the posterior view, which articulates with the femur. It actually sits in between the two condyles of the distal femur. One more thing to mention about the patella is that it is a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bones are bones that form inside of a tendon or ligament. And their presence in the body is generally pretty variable. And so you may have sesamoid bones just randomly appear in tendons and ligaments sometimes. They're usually pretty small. They usually don't cause any problem. And we usually don't include them in the bone count for the body just because they're small and they're variable and they don't really serve much purpose. The patella is different. So the patella, one, does serve a purpose, and two, it is large, and three, it is present in pretty much all people. It would be an abnormality to not have the patella. So the patella is the largest sesamoid bone, and it is formed inside of the patellar ligament. So we can't see it in this picture, but the patellar ligament runs from the quadriceps muscles, which would be found here. The quadriceps is a group of muscles that would be found here. And they form a common quadriceps tendon, which travels down and inserts on the tibial tuberosity right here. The patella is a sesamoid bone that grows within that patellar tendon or ligament. Now remember, a tendon attaches muscle to bone and a ligament attaches bone to bone. And so there is some disagreement on what we should call this tendon or ligament. All right. Now it's a tendon because it ultimately attaches the quadriceps muscles to the tibia. It's also a ligament because it attaches the patella to the tibia. I really don't care if people call it a tendon or a ligament. Just understand that different textbooks will call it different things. Some will call it a patellar tendon or quadriceps tendon. Others will refer to it as the patellar ligament. And when we get to the joints unit, we'll see the actual tendon or ligament there. All right, so we are down into the leg proper, or the lowest portion of the leg here. Again, when we use the word leg, it has an actual meaning, which is this region of the lower limb. You might call it the shin. It includes the crural and the sural regions. The crural region would be your shin, and the sural region would be where your calf muscle is posteriorly. One way to remember that is that shin and calf both start with S and C. I'm sorry, they start with S and C. Crural and sural also start with S and C, but they're reversed. The shin is in the crural region and the calf is in the sural region. If that mnemonic device doesn't help you, you don't have to memorize it. But it helps a lot of people. All right, so down here we have the tibia. Tibia is kind of easy to spot. Remember we said the ulna had a U-shaped head, and so it was easy to spot because of that U. Here we have the tibia, which has a sort of T-shaped head. Okay, kind of easy to spot there. It's got a T-shaped head. Now, this is kind of odd nomenclature, but the tibia has a medial condyle and a lateral condyle, a medial and lateral condyle also. The femur had a medial and lateral condyle. Here the tibia does as well. But it doesn't look like the other condyles we're familiar with, which are rounded projections of bone. The lateral and the medial condyles of the tibia are flattened concave surfaces. Okay. Now, over here, the tibial tuberosity can be easily palpated. By the way, that word palpate may or may not show up on the exam. To palpate a thing means to feel it or touch it. And so when we talk about bone features, it's common to say this bone feature can be easily palpated by touching the blah, blah, blah. In this case, if you feel your knee and then you run your finger down the tibia, about 2 inches below the kneecap, you should be able to feel a pretty prominent bone marking or tuberosity or protuberance here. All right, and that's the tibial tuberosity. And so we mentioned the quadriceps tendon or the patellar ligament, whatever you want to call that. It inserts on the tibial tuberosity. And when the quadriceps muscles are going to contract, they're going to pull on that tendon or ligament. And because it's attached to the tibial tuberosity, it'll then pull on the tibia. All right, so we talked about the tibia. There's an anterior border or crest, and that can be felt pretty prominently as well. All right, then the other bone over here, we have the fibula. Now, different textbooks are going to disagree on this point. Some say it bears no weight. Others say it bears almost no weight. Okay, and I'm not gonna split hairs like that. I don't like doing that. I just want you to be aware that different sources will say different things. It's my opinion that it does not bear weight. Its main purpose, it would be better to say its main purpose is not bearing weight, but rather to stabilize the tibia. Its main purpose is to stabilize the tibia. Okay, and it does that with this interosseous membrane. That interosseous membrane, remember we saw one between the radius and the ulna also in the antebrachium. Inter means between, osseous means bone, so it's a membrane between the bones that holds them together, and it stabilizes this joint both proximally and distally. All right, now down at the other end, if you go ahead and reach down to your ankle, you're going to feel a bony protuberance on the medial side and a bony protuberance on the lateral side. A lot of people call these the ankle bones. These are actually not the ankle bones. Remember, the wrist bones were the distal parts of the radius and ulna. That is, the bones that everyone calls wrist bones were the actually the styloid processes at the distal end of the radius and the ulna. Well, the same thing's going on here. Those two bony bumps that everyone calls the ankle bones are actually the lateral and medial malleolus of the fibula and the tibia. Okay? Tibia has the medial malleolus. The fibula is located laterally. In fact, you can see over here there's a mnemonic. The fibula is lateral. To help you remember that the fibula is on the lateral side, it's also going to be on the pinky toe side. Okay? Tibia is going to be medial, and it's going to be on the hallux or big toe side of the, well, lower limb. Another mnemonic that we've used before is if you put your two ankles together, those two bony bumps that we talked about, the medial malleoli, they would touch each other. And so another mnemonic is the tibia touches the other tibia. If you put your two ankles together and you put those two bony bumps together, the medial malleoli, the tibia of your right the medial malleolus of your right tibia touches the medial malleolus of your left tibia. So that's another one to help you remember their location. Um, Good. Moving down from there, do we have pictures? Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll just go through it one by one. We have the tarsal bones, okay, and these are the actual ankle bones. Just like we had carpal bones in the wrist, the tarsal bones are the actual ankle. Making up the sole of the foot are the metatarsals, just like we had metacarpals in the palm of the hand. And then distally, we're going to have phalanges, just like we had in the fingers or digits. The toes are also referred to as digits, and they will also have phalanges. And actually, the organization of the phalanges in the feet is the foot digits is actually the same as it was in the hands. There are going to be 14 of them. The pollex, the thumb, had two phalanges. The hallux, or big toe, also has two phalanges. And then the other digits, even though they're so small, it may be a little hard to believe, they will all have three phalanges. Okay? Even the little toe, three phalanges. And so 14 total phalanges in each foot. Okay? Left has 14, the right has 14. All right, so we move on. We'll run through this pretty quickly. So the tarsus is the ankle region, and there are 7 tarsal bones. Now that's worth mentioning. There were 8 carpal bones, 7 tarsal bones. So that is one significant distinction between the two. So we have the talus, the calcaneus, which is the heel bone. Now the calcaneus is definitely worth remembering. It is the largest of the tarsal bones, and it also forms your heel, the heel of the foot. We also have the navicular, and then we have 3 cuneiforms, and from medial to lateral, they are the first, second, and third cuneiform bones. And then lastly, we have the cuboid bone. The metatarsus, or is a region, the metatarsal bones are the bones in the sole of the foot. Okay. And they're just like the metacarpals we had in the palm of the hand. They make up the sole of the foot and the dorsal surface of the foot. And they articulate with the 3 cuneiform bones and the cuboid. The distal ends of the metatarsals are, of course, going to articulate with the proximal phalanges. And the phalanges are the exact same as we saw in the hand. And so we go back here, and this is a superior view. In back here, you have the calcaneus. And the calcaneus forms, again, your heel bone. And it's the largest of the tarsal bones. It's a pretty big bone. Second largest is going to be the talus over here, and the talus articulates pretty clearly here with the tibia. All right. Good, 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 good. What else are we talking about? Next up, you have the cuneiform, okay, which is this sort of rectangular shaped one. Then over here we have the cuboid, which is kind of sort of cube shaped. And then you have the three cuneiforms, which from medial to lateral are first, second, and third. Medial is first, just like we have the metatarsal one located medially on the big toe side. You could maybe remember it that way. The first cuneiform is medial, and then from there we go lateral to the second, and then the third, and then further over we have the cuboid. Now these metatarsals, the cuneiforms 1 through 3 and the cuboid laterally, articulate with the bases of the metatarsals, okay, numbered 1 through 5 starting on the hallux or big toe side, ending at number 5 on the pinky toe side. Uh, and the heads of these metatarsals are going to articulate with the proximal phalanges. Of course, you remember there are only two phalanges in the hallux, so there's a proximal and a distal. The other toes have three phalanges, and so there's a proximal, a middle, and a distal phalange or phalanx. Here's a mnemonic for the tarsal bones. Tall centers never take shots from corners. All right, so talus, calcaneus, navicular, third cuneiform, second cuneiform, first cuneiform, and cuboid. Um, good. So we've covered just about everything here that I wanted to say. I'm not sure that we mentioned it, and I wanted to be clear. The metatarsals, just like the metacarpals, they both have a base located proximally, they have a shaft, and then they have a head located distally. Okay? All right. Okay, good. I've got this feeling like there was one more thing I wanted to say about phalanges, but I feel like we covered it all. All right, so the calcaneus is pictured here. Remember that is a very large tarsal bone, and it forms the heel bone. And if you look, it really comprises maybe a quarter of what you would normally call the foot. A quarter to one third of what you would think of as your foot is the calcaneal bone or the calcaneus. All right, and then there are three arches to the foot. There's a medial longitudinal arch. There's a lateral longitudinal arch, and then there's a transverse arch to the foot. Three arches of the foot. All right, so that's kind of an old slide. All right, so that's it for today. If I have time, I might get into joints. We're going to do an abbreviated version of the joints lecture.